but he couldn't move an inch. Oh my God, it's finally here. You really thought I was some dumbass Mother Teresa who wouldn't know to hit back when attacked? You really thought I was some dumbass Mother Teresa who wouldn't know how to hit back when attacked? You really thought carrying one person would weaken me to the point that I'll be incapable of slapping your cheek right back? Chiu Haitang was shocked. What's happening? She made to draw her sword, but Shen Qingqiu cut in. Miss Chiu, I offer you a word of advice. Do not draw your sword and do not rashly use your spiritual energy if you don't want to share his fate. Doubtful, Chiu Haitang circled around to the old palace master's front, then let out a shrill scream. Fleshy green protrusions had sprouted between the dense wrinkles on the old palace master's aged face. He seemed to be in such intense pain that not only could he not move, he couldn't even speak. Chiu Haitang's voice trembled. Shenqiu, what have you done? Nothing at all, said Shen Qingqiu. Don't forget, this is someone else's tomb. Did you think that the demons would have failed to install protections? The tufts of white fluff floating in the air like dandelion seeds scattered in the wind were actually a type of demonic plant called, quote, ties that bind, unquote. This plant sowed its seeds in the bodies of living beings, and they were especially attracted to people who gave off energy. Recklessly deploying one's spiritual or demonic energy attracted these seeds to oneself. That was why Shen Qingqiu had stuck to physical combat as much as possible and avoided using his spiritual energy. When ties that bind seeds entered one's flesh, they didn't hurt, only faintly itched. But once they sprouted from the flesh that was their soil and burst forth through the skin, every inch of rent flesh from which they grew erupted in violent agony. Furthermore, the more you use your spiritual energy, the faster they grew. If you went as far as to use a spiritual blast, they would sprout like mad, budding in an instant. This whole time, the old palace master had been attacking with his roars. His spiritual flow had been gathered in his head and throat, and now his face teemed with plumped sprouts. The inside of his mouth and throat were certainly also stuffed full of the things. The sprouts' short stalks were covered with thin fuzz and blood vessels, but their roots continued to stretch down beneath the skin, extending until they intertwined with his nerves. Shen Qingqiu clicked his tongue. Old palace master, you must not keep yelling and screaming. If the ties that bind proliferate and grow into your brain, there really will be no going back. This scene was both disgusting and horrifying. Chiu Haitang covered her mouth and trembled until she could finally bear it no longer. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she fainted on the spot. One couldn't move an inch and one was unconscious. TBK! Shen Qingqiu let out a sigh of relief. Holding Luo Binghe, he struggled to his feet. Muscles tensed, the old palace master slurred out. Don't celebrate too early. You'll know better. Merely saying those few words made his face twist in pain, the sprouts all over his face trembling along with his movement. Shen Qingqiu gave him an "ah" in response. A deep, uncontrollable pain crawled up from his right arm to his shoulder. When Shen Qingqiu blocked those 2 sword strikes, he had been forced to use spiritual energy, and now he was finally sprouting as well. But that was fine. Luo Binghe was safe at last. Seeing that Shen Qingqiu was going to leave, half carrying, half dragging Luo Binghe along with him, a cry escaped the old palace master's throat. In his urgency, he crashed out of the little cart, and his limbless body squirmed excruciatingly through the thicket of flowers and grasses covering the ground, scooting forward inch by inch, a terrifying yet pitiful sight. Don't go, the old palace master muttered. Don't Don't go! Don't you go! Shen Qingqiu fled even faster, but he never expected that the old palace master's eyes would snap open and another roar would explode from his throat. He was going to attack even at the cost of his own life. Shen Qingqiu could no longer tell if the old palace master was trying to keep them there or take Luo Binghe's life. He barely managed to block again with his already cracking sheath. The vibration travelled down his right arm, stirring the bloody sprouts just beginning to emerge from it. Gut-wrenching agony tore through him, but he still didn't let go of Luo Binghe. Boistered by the extreme pain, his fighting spirit climbed, and he glared at the old palace master, murderous intent raging in his eyes. After that yell, quite a number of fleshy sprouts broke once more through the old palace master's skin, some even growing from the corners of his eyes. He seemed unable to even feel pain at this point, and he cackled in fits of laughter, rolling around on the ground like a hunk of pork to Qiu Haitang's side. He yelled into her ear, "Aren't you going to kill Shen Qingqiu? He's right before your eyes and you're asleep. Get up! Kill him! Kill them all!" At this yell, Qiu Haitang gradually drifted awake to an old face, gnarled like a dried orange peel, inches from her own, one that was furthermore covered in strange growths, pocked densely with bloody holes, and was scared out of her wits on the spot. She screamed and screamed, drawing her sword and flailing it at empty air. Afraid she would rashly call on her spiritual energy and draw the ties that bind seeds to herself as well, Shen Qingqiu called out, "Calm down!" "Quick, quick!" the old palace master squawked. "Weren't you always begging for my help? They can't hold on much longer to it now." Only when Qiu Haitang had Shen Qingqiu in her field of vision did she come back to her senses, just slightly. Her hands shook and her eyes were blank. To tell the truth, Shen Qingqiu didn't really hold a grudge against Qiu Haitang. She was a victim of the original flavor after all. But if she insisted on blocking their way here, he would have to fight her. But in defiance of all his expectations, Qiu Haitang didn't indiscriminately attack like before. She just stared blankly at Shen Qingqiu, then at Luo Binghe lying in his arms. Not only did she not advance, she even retreated a few steps. "It's not possible, not possible," she said, her lips trembling. "It's fake, it's all fake. It wasn't my brother. My brother didn't do anything wrong. It couldn't have been him. You're lying." "What's this?" Shen Qingqiu thought. "I didn't know," she sobbed and screamed. "I didn't know he was like that. I didn't do anything at all. So why did I have to suffer for so many years?" Shen Qingqiu was shocked. Qiu Haitang had been unconscious for only a brief moment. Why was she practically a different person upon waking? Or perhaps it was more like she had seen something she couldn't accept and been terrified into insanity. Shen Qingqiu knew something was up. He said sternly, "Don't thrash about." "What are you waiting for?" the old palace master yelled. Qiu Haitang lost her mind and screamed at Shen Qingqiu, huddling with her arms over her head. "What exactly did you think of me? Did you hate me, pity me, wanted to suffer a fate worse than death? Why didn't you kill me? Why didn't you kill me?" Shen Qingqiu was completely mystified. Qiu Haitang turned and ran. "Come back!" he cried after her. "Randomly running around the holy mausoleum means certain death." But she had already fled, and he didn't have the time to chase her. Shen Qingqiu experienced a strange sense of dejection, or perhaps loss. He didn't know exactly how he felt about this. After a while, he mentally lit a candle for Qiu Haitang, then continued on. As Qiu Haitang had run off, and Shen Qingqiu was also walking away, the old palace master lost his last thread of hope. He sprawled numbly on the ground, then suddenly dropped his head to chomp on a mouthful of grass and leaves. He chewed and laughed, cackling and gaffling, as the fleshy sprouts on his face grew denser and denser, faster and faster, until they blanketed his entire head. Not long later, he could no longer laugh. Shen Qingqiu could almost hear the noise of his skull and brain being compressed. The old palace master's breath came in rough pants before his head thudded heavily to the ground. He would never lift it again. The leader of a sect dying in such a wretched and frightful manner. It really was a cause for pity. Before Shen Qingqiu had gone very far, an indistinct voice sounded by his ear, as if it was coming from all directions at once. There was a smile in Tianlongjun's tone. Peak Lord Shen has played such a spectacular game of hide and seek. Why don't we guess when we'll meet again? Shen Qingqiu rubbed his leg and found his hand covered in foreign matter. Cold sweat poured from his forehead. The ties that bind had already followed his blood vessels down to his leg. Tianlongjun spoke through the voice-transmitting spell again. By heading straight east, are you trying to escape the holy Muslim through the tier in the barrier? The bastard even knew which way he was going. Shen Qingqiu kept his surprise to himself and looked down. Once the ties that bind on his leg fully took root, he wouldn't be able to walk even if he tried. He clenched his teeth and glanced at Luo Binghe. Steeling himself, he tore open his hem, grabbed a handful of bloody sprouts, and pulled. His brain went blank for what could have been half a minute. A whole chunk of his flesh seemed to have been torn out. Shen Qingqiu panted for breath. Only after slowly coming back to his senses did he discover that his breath sounded very much like sobs. He couldn't even wipe his face. He had no way to do so. It really hurt too fucking much. Though his blood was flowing in rivers, at least he could walk now. He had thought Luo Binghe was in a wretched state, but if anyone else saw him now, they'd find his condition 120% more wretched. Tianlongjun knew their location, so he had to be rushing here already. If Shen Qingqiu kept going east with Luo Binghe, they'd definitely run headfirst into those two wonderful relatives of his. After leaving that primeval forest of a tomb hall, Shen Qingqiu passed another chamber. He rapidly went in and selected a relatively clean and comfortable stone coffin and, supporting Luo Binghe's head, carefully settled him inside. When he tested Luo Binghe's forehead with the back of his hand, it was still scalding hot, and the mark in the center of his forehead was growing even redder and brighter. Shen Qingqiu placed Xingmo's sword beneath Luo Binghe's hand, calmed himself, then slowly closed the coffin. Tianlongjun strolled in front. Zhu Zilang followed close behind. After a turn in the corridor, they found Shen Qingqiu, Shoya sword in hand, standing in the center of a mausoleum hall. He looked at them with a cool gaze, as if he had been waiting for a long time. Half of his teal robes had been dyed scarlet, and fresh blood still dripped down his right hand along the dried traces of old gore. His lips were nearly as pale as his face. Tianlongjun was shocked. We were only separated for a mere moment. How has Peak Lord Shen ended up in such a woeful state? Shen Qingqiu looked back at him. Tianlongjun had been swallowed by a flaming pillar of magma in the Hall of Fury, yet he didn't smell of so much as a single scorched sesame seed. At most, his black robes were a bit singed at the edges. What the hell kind of logic was that? Where is Peak Lord Shen's beloved disciple? Tianlongjun asked. He left, said Shen Qingqiu. Tianlongjun smiled. Peak Lord Shen is still here. How could he have left? Shen Qingqiu smiled back. After this exchange of smiles, Tianlongjun suddenly found himself unable to continue doing so. He had discovered that he couldn't take another step. He looked down. At some point, he had been covered by a layer of super hard crystal clear ice from his feet to his waist, and the ice was still inching up his body. Zhu Zilang's situation was a bit more severe. Both his legs and one of his arms had already been frozen solid. Only now did Tianlongjun notice that this Muslim hall was extremely cold. He paused, then said, "The Morbei clan." This Muslim hall had been constructed by Morbei Jun's father. Their bloodline was adept at controlling ice. These powers were unrivaled among the demon race, with none their equal, so the power of this hall also revolved around ice magic. The holy mausoleum was filled with settings and props for Shen Qingqiu's use. He didn't need to attack anyone with his own hands. There were plenty of things that could entrap his enemies. Shen Qingqiu had remembered that the original work said that whenever anything warmer than the air in this hall entered, he would be frozen on the spot. Turned into an ice statue, after a couple of days, the ice statue would then shatter into shards. Before he came in, he had activated his spiritual meridians to lower his body temperature as far as it could go. That was why his face was so pale. During this brief exchange, ice had already crept up to Tianlongjun's chest. The expression on his face didn't waver as demonic qi roiled in his hand, but it was unable to melt through the ice wrapped around his fist. So it came to little effect. Even if this ice couldn't keep him frozen forever, it would delay him for at least an hour. "So, I genuinely wasn't mistaken," Tianlongjun said. "Peak Lord Shen knows my race forbidden mausoleum practically as well as the back of his hand." Without another word, Shen Qingqiu waved, and he was off in a swirl of robes. Tianlongjun took a look at Zhu Zilang and leisurely said, "I told you that if you were truly determined to bring Peak Lord Shen to the demon realm, you would have to guarantee that he wouldn't cause trouble. You know what you have to do." "This subordinate understands," Zhu Zilang quietly responded. Upon hearing this exchange, Shen Qingqiu suddenly felt as if he might have forgotten something very important.